And Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford is suing to block Trump from removing birthright citizenship. Ford joins a total of 22 attorneys general in that lawsuit. The topic of birthright citizenship has been highly contested since Trump first took office back in 2016. This new executive order ends automatic citizenship for children born in the United States to anyone who is not a legal permanent resident.
If allowed to stand, this executive order would mean that some babies born in Nevada who would have been citizens will no longer enjoy the privileges and benefits of citizenship.
And Attorney General Ford says that this will harm hundreds of thousands of Nevadans and the state itself. He believes that the executive order will cause states to lose federal funding for programs like Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and foster care and adoption assistance programs. If the executive order stands, it would be the first time since the 1800s that citizenship would be denied to thousands of children born each year.